In this module, we'll begin working with FreakC directly. After downloading and installing it, we'll have a look at the interface and run a simple model to get started. Before we get into FreakC, let's note that a number of geochemical modeling codes have been developed over the past few decades, as soon as suitable computing platforms became available. As with anything else, their sophistication has increased over that time. Early codes had limited databases, primitive iteration schemes, and limited capabilities, for example. So FreakC stands for pH redox equilibrium. It's basically state-of-the-art, and as we will see, it can address a wide range of problems, and is really only limited by the amount of data typically available to inform the construction of a model. Its only widely used peer at the moment with the same capabilities is the Geochemist Workbench, which is a commercial product. So why should we choose FreakC? Well, it can solve a variety of problems, examples of which will be introduced throughout this course. It's very widely used and is well vetted. It has a reasonably robust numerical engine. It's not completely foolproof, but I've found that it works most of the time. It offers several different thermodynamic databases for all the mass action equations. Some of these databases are quite large. It offers a nice user interface to assist with problem setup, at least for Windows users. And you can't beat the price. It's free. Ideally, we'll be working with the version of FreakC that comes with the user interface. This only works for Windows users, so the rest of you will need to download the batch version. You can download FreakC by following the link shown here. The link will direct you to this download page. Again, please use the graphical user interface version if you are able. Otherwise, select the appropriate batch version for your computer, and that will suffice. Once you've downloaded the appropriate installation file, follow the installation instructions provided on the same web page. It's not shown here. Do note that later in the course, we will all need to use the batch version to enable us to work with a Python script. So FreakC's input consists of a single text file that is organized by keyword blocks. There's a great built-in help system to provide details for each keyword block, along with some examples. I'd encourage you to have a look through this as we proceed along in the course. The keywords themselves provide some insights into what you can do with FreakC. This includes for example, equilibrating a solution with a set of mineral or gas phases and or a gas mixture, adding a reactant to a system that essentially reacts irreversibly with the solution. That is best explained by example later. Specifying solid solutions or hybrid composition mineral phases that can change their formulations as part of a simulation. Reactive mineral surfaces, including complexation onto hydrated metal oxides, as well as cation exchange. Reaction kinetics, and rudimentary reactor transport. There are some additional FreakC capabilities that we will not be covering as part of this course. So that you are aware, these include inverse modeling. We've already touched on this earlier. Complete one-dimensional advective dispersive transport modeling, because we'll be covering this topic with the FAST model later on in the course instead. And we'll be skipping the electrostatic details of the diffuse double-layer model for surface complexation. This is an advanced topic and would be something of a major sidebar endeavor for a general course such as this one. FreakC is really quite versatile. This figure gives some insight into the number of ways that you can handle reactions between the aqueous phase and a mineral phase, for example. A mineral can be modeled as an equilibrium phase, which is free to reversibly dissolve or precipitate depending on conditions. Or it can be fixed as a dissolve-only or a precipitate-only mineral phase. It can be modeled as an irreversible dissolution reaction. It can be modeled as a kinetic reaction, either for dissolution or precipitation. Or, depending on the problem, its saturation state with respect to the solution composition can merely be monitored with no mass transfer occurring at all. So at this point, let's assume you've installed FreakC and are ready to get started with all of this. For Windows users, once you've installed the user interface supplied version of FreakC and run it, this is what you'll see. minus the actual problem definition shown here, because we haven't done that yet. Various keyword blocks can be invoked by clicking on the appropriate buttons. The same information can be typed into the main file display area if you prefer. Users of the batch version of Freak-C will prepare a text file that corresponds to the information shown here in the main display area. So Freak-C comes with several databases. We'll say more about these in a later module. The starting default database is freakc.dat. The database defines the master species for each element and contains mass action expressions and equilibrium constants for the reactions that define the secondary species. Other parameters include correction factors for activity coefficients and for temperature. The database can be viewed as a tab in the user interface supplied version of Freak-C, but should not be edited by the user. You can select a new database to use for a particular simulation under the Options menu or as a pop-up option when you press the Run button. For the batch version, the database and its file location are indicated on the very first line of the input file. To run your first Freak-C model, type in the information shown here. Basic solution parameters include pH, PE, units of concentration, and the concentrations of individual elements. If you're using the user interface supplied version, some of these items will be filled in automatically for you, but you're free to change them if you wish. I should mention that C4 represents total inorganic carbon, which has a redox state of +4. This is something we'll discuss later. Freak-C will produce an output file when it finishes, similar to what is shown on the right. So more here on the output file. As you scroll down, you'll see a summary of the concentrations of each element, the pH and the implied charge imbalance, if any. This would be an artifact of the starting composition supplied by the user. Next, you'll see a breakdown of the speciation of each element in solution, which is conceptually similar to our previous exercise with the Excel spreadsheet. Finally, you'll see a summary of the saturation states of the various mineral and gas phases considered by Freak-C from its database, according to the elements included in the model. The log saturation index is the log transformed activity ratio of the mineral dissolution equation's constituent species divided by its equilibrium constant. A log saturation index of less than 0 means that the mineral or gas phase would dissolve if present. The log saturation index equal to 0 means that the mineral gas phase is in an equilibrium condition with the solution. And finally, a log saturation index greater than 0 implies that the mineral will be favored to precipitate from solution if this had been requested by the user during setup of the problem. So let's add a feature to our model and specify an equilibrium phase keyword block. For each item in the block, post the name of the phase. There can be more than one. We'll get to that shortly. Set the log saturation index. Remember, 0 is in equilibrium with respect to the thermodynamic database. And lastly, specify the initial moles present. Don't worry if the latter number is too large. The model will only dissolve enough to achieve equilibrium and will leave the rest untouched. After running the model, you'll note that some calcite has dissolved, the element concentrations have changed, and the pH is increased with respect to the previous run. Note now that the solution is indeed in equilibrium with calcite, as we had requested. So here, we've simply added more phases to the problem. Note that we've now included CO2 gas setting its log saturation index equal to -2 is equivalent to fixing the CO2 partial pressure in solution, otherwise known as fugacity, to be in equilibrium with the atmospheric partial pressure of 0.01 atmospheres, something you might encounter in a soil or groundwater environment. After running this, Freak-C's output has automatically grown a little more complex now that new elements, this would be magnesium and sulfate, are now included in the model. So here, rather than adding another equilibrium phase, this example shows how to set up a reactant keyword block. A reactant is an irreversible non-equilibrium phase that is force-fed into solution, which then re-equilibrates internally. In this example, no sodium hydroxide will precipitate no matter how much is added, even if its equilibrium saturation is somehow exceeded. Rather, more and more sodium will be added into solution, and the pH will increase because sodium hydroxide is a strong base. Note that Freak-C now lists the speciation of sodium in the model as a response to the presence of the Na term in the reactant stoichiometry. So here's an exercise to try with the simple model we've put together so far. You could try adding lime or calcium oxide as a reactant. How does calcite respond as an equilibrium phase? How does dolomite? How does CO2 gas? Do all the results you see make sense? Also, what happens to the log saturation index of calcium hydroxide, which is otherwise known as portlandite? How does adding portlandite as a reactant, as opposed to an equilibrium phase, affect this result?